Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Kelsey Wiskirkin. I am Warp's Executive Director. Thank you all for being here today for our 2022 virtual annual meeting. We had a couple of programs this morning, and we are resuming our program after a break with Arushi Chowdhury Khanna, who will be our afternoon, well, depending on the time zone you're in, our afternoon keynote speaker. So welcome back to you all. It is just on the hour, so I'm going to just dive right back in. And again, thank you all for being here with us. One thing I wanted to mention is when we checked our registration yesterday, we have people joining us from 25 different countries today. So wherever you're joining us from, welcome and thank you for being here. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Arushi Chowdhury Khanna. Arushi is the founder of LoomKatha, which is a play on the Hindi word Lok Katha, meaning fairy tale, a story of the people, by the people, and for the people of India. LoomKatha has been instrumental in reviving the rare Himroo weaving, an ornate brocade style weaving that was nearly lost. In her presentation, Arushi will weave together stories of tradition and innovation, as well as important considerations of LoomKatha's role in community stewardship. Arushi, welcome to you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really very excited to be presenting to such a diverse audience. The theme of this year's WARP conference really spoke to me because so much of what we do lies at the intersection of, tradition, maintaining tradition, innovating it to make it relevant in today's context, and building a community both within the weavers whom we work with, as well as the larger sort of market and audience for whom we produce the textiles that we do. So thank you, Kelsey, for inviting me. And it's been a while since I've been associated with WARP, and it's always been such a wonderful and meaningful experience because people come from a place of caring for textiles and loving textiles, and appreciating the work we do, which is always nice. So I'm just going to try sharing my screen now. Please let me know if it works.
See it? Yeah, absolutely. There you go. Beautiful.
Okay. So I'm Arushi, and I'm really going to talk about the themes of this conference: tradition, innovation, and community stewardship, through the context of a very special project that I initiated in 2018, the Himroo Revival Project. Himroo is a rare and precious weave that originated in Western India in the 13th century. I'm sorry, the slides are just taking on a life of their own. Give me a second. Yeah, so Himroo is an ornate brocade weave that originated in Western India in the city of Aurangabad in the 13th century, when Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq brought Persian weavers to the region who interacted with the local cotton weavers. And thus this beautiful brocade was born, which has a cotton base and a silk extra weft ornamentation on it. So it was always the textile of the royals. It was patronized by the royalty and nobility of the region, as well as being traded as a luxury textile across the world. So when I set up LoomKatha in 2017, after almost a decade of working with various NGOs in the handloom and craft space in India, this was one of the first weaves that I wanted to work with. primarily because I I had heard apocryphal stories about its beauty and its richness. But in all my time at working in the sector, I had never seen an actual Himroo textile. So this was, and the primary motive of setting up LoomKatha was to work with crafts that are languishing, that lack market or infrastructural support, and seeing how we can make a difference to these weavers and improve the marketability and quality of their product. So it was, all very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed that I landed in Aurangabad in 2018 to begin my research into, this famous textile. But to my utter dismay, I was still not able to find a real hand-woven Himroo. There were shops across the city selling what claimed to be Himroo, and what actually turned out to be, I'm sorry, the slides are a bit distracting. Just give me a moment to understand if there's something wrong with the settings. Yes. So hopefully we should be fine now. So as I was saying, I could find a lot of shops across the city talking about Himroo, but what they were actually selling was this cheap synthetic bed sheet and terry towel kind of product that was produced in the local mills of the area. It was made using viscose and polyester yarns. But as you can see, what they had done is they had taken the paisley and certain of the flowers, which were traditional to the Himroo aesthetic, and made sort of these dumbed down versions of the textile, which had, of course, directly impacted the handloom weaver. And as a result, I learned that most of the looms had gradually shut down, and there was no actual hand weaving being done in Aurangabad. So that's when our sort of treasure hunt began. And we looked at, finding out, going from government organizations to, sort of other NGOs working with other crafts, going to the mills themselves to understand. And what we learned is a lot of the mill owners told us that their ancestors had been involved in hand weaving, but eventually they found the mill weaving much more lucrative, and the handloom weaver continued to get more and more exploited, as a result of which it was no longer a paying occupation. And probably the last loom to be operational had shut down in around 2010. So that was a dismal picture that was painted for us. And really, it seemed like this tradition was completely dead and had been corrupted into these, very useful, and I must say very utilitarian bed sheets. But the original textile wasn't available. And it was only through continuously sort of, digging up information that we were ultimately able to locate one family that used to run a small workshop of Himroo handlooms. And it was, in fact, they were the last standing workshop who had tried to continue to keep the tradition alive till 2010. And it was with them that we found these beautiful swatches of the original handloom textile. These are some of the most complex Himroo designs that you can see. They are 4 colors and 5 colors, and a really very lavish and ornate aesthetic. And these we stumbled upon in literally in gunny bags and old pillowcases that they had been saved in by chance, because one of the sons of the household couldn't bear to throw them away. So he had somehow managed to salvage them. And this was really the starting point. And at last I was able to see what an actual Himroo textile looked like. And this gave me the confidence to, to think that we can take this project ahead. And so we applied for research grants, and we were successful in March of 2019 to receive our first grant towards research and restoration of a couple of looms. So if you can see on the left hand side, this was the status of the last two standing looms that we found literally in a shed. And they were completely decrepit. The harnessing, the warping, the warp structure, everything was completely destroyed. It was just the basic wooden structure of the loom that remained. And it then took us a while to find a one weaver who was still alive and who was now driving a small minivan to transport goods as his source of livelihood, who agreed to start weaving for us. And so we began restoring the looms, often burning the midnight oil, because we didn't really have technicians who could do the job for us. The entire ecosystem had basically collapsed. So it was not just about locating the weaver, it was about all the ancillary activities around weaving as well that were very hard to replicate. And we eventually worked with the technicians from the mills who still knew the basics of how to handle and set up a handloom, and worked with them during their holiday hours, and finally managed to set up the first loom. So you can see that the picture in the center is the same loom that has then been transformed with the warp and basic harnessing structure set in place. The designs that we found, we then went on to create the graphs for those designs uh, in uh, in Banaras, which is in central India, where the technical know-how still existed. And this was really the phase one of the project, where you can see the very first piece that we wove, the one on the left hand side, is a complete mishmash of design and structure. The original design is barely visible because we were still learning how to harness the jacquard and the shafts and the coordination between all of these aspects. And eventually then we went on to weave a two-color design, a single color design on a white base, and eventually move on to more complex two-color and three-color designs. So this entire process took us over a year. And it was around March of 2020 that we finally had products that we felt could be marketed, that were of a quality and aesthetic that matched the original Himroo. But as we all know, March 2020 was also the time that COVID-19 struck the world, and India was in a severe lockdown. Aurangabad, the city where we were working, was very severely affected. And as it happened, the second phase of our grant project was shifted towards a health budget. So we suddenly had now 3 looms set up. We had one of the traditional weavers who had trained 3 more young women in this craft, and we didn't know what to do. So which is when we launched a campaign on Instagram called Calm Not Done, which basically meant pre-order work with us. We don't want aid, we don't want donations, but we need you to support the project and support the weavers through this extremely trying time. And to my amazement, we're a small organization. We don't have thousands of followers on Instagram, but that little appeal worked, and we were able to, keep the weavers' income levels the same for the next 6 months that the lockdown continued. And we were also able to shift the looms closer to their home, so they didn't have to travel far to weave. After about 4 months, we were able to resume weaving and start producing the orders that people had pre-booked with us. And this is how really we realized that this project has a life of its own. And, we are going to keep it alive despite everything. So that really was a test of faith, and it worked out very beautifully for us. Post that, we have the challenge has been to keep the looms running, to ensure that we have continuous workflow and that we continue to refine and finesse the product, because Himroo is such a complex textile. I feel like we have only scratched the surface in terms of design and in terms of technical structure of what the original textile was. So that is our aim, to continue to, to highlight the traditional textile, to restore it to its original glory, to use the yarns that were originally used, which are no longer easily available, to use the colors, the aesthetic, and of course the weaving skill of the weavers. But alongside that, what we have realized is that we also do need to innovate, because the reason that Himroo died out was not just because of the competition from the mills, but because the textile itself was becoming obsolete. And there is always a need to, to ensure that it reaches a market that wants it or needs it in today's context. So, and I do want to draw attention to one of our key customers. It's a brand in the US called the Ibu Movement, which, who came to us just towards the end of lockdown and converted these beautiful textiles into these very contemporary jackets. So we worked with them on not changing a single aspect of the design or of the structure or of the raw material, but just looking at colors and looking at the eventual use of the textile. And I think the result was flattering both to the brand as well as to the original Himroo textile, and they have always credited and given the name Himroo its due credit. And this is something that has become a very special project for us, because it showed us that we could continuously, meet the challenges of a new customer, a completely new market. Himroo had never been sold in the US before. And at the same time, stay true to our tradition. So I feel that, when we talk about innovation in the handloom space, it's always this balancing act of, what do you retain and what do you change. You cannot change the character so completely of a textile in the name of innovation, because that is what you feel is going to work. So it's always this very tricky and fine balance between maintaining the essence of the textile while looking at newer applicability and newer uses for the textile. And I think then we've gone on to do a number of very interesting projects. We worked with an Indian designer to use completely naturally dyed yarns. So this entire collection we did with them with colors that were from plants and roots and natural pigments. And this again was a first for Himroo, because by this time everything is obviously synthetically dyed. And the nature of the fabric is such, there's a three-dimensional effect of the extra weft being lifted above the base fabric, for which you do need a lot of contrast in the colors and in the way the design is structured. So we were able to do basic Himroo designs, but we were able to use the new yarns to sort of modify the loom a little bit, so that it was easy for the weavers to weave these natural dyed yarns, which tend to be brittle and not so easy to weave as synthetically dyed ones. So yes, so this was another very interesting project we did in terms of innovation. And the third was really at really the intersection between tradition and innovation. because this was, so on the left-hand side, you can see Mr. Vasant Khoje. He is the oldest and senior most weaver we located. He was working as a salesperson in a textile shop. And he's over 75 years old. He began weaving when he was 11 years old. And he really, took a lot of convincing to come back to weaving, because they had seen the decline of the weave and they had seen the consequences of it. And it was really a big risk for them to come back. But once they did, he worked with us for a client to create a pure silk himroo. Now, while this was something that was traditionally woven in the 1960s and 70s in India, and he remembered it, he said that only, about a handful of weavers even then was skilled enough to do this. It had, of course, completely been lost. And at the same time, today, the quality of silk is far different from what was available then. So there was a need to look at what are we working with now? What is it that was being woven, and how do we meet these two in the middle and create something that is an absolutely stunning textile? And we continue to weave these. We managed to weave only 2 or 3 pieces a month, but it's really a very fruitful endeavor to understand how we can further refine the craft and work with what we have, but at the same time create something beautiful. So, and Vasant Mama's story really leads me into, the final piece of today's conversation, which is, community stewardship and what it means to the weavers to do the work that they do. And Himroo, in that sense, was a very, 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 very difficult project, because there was no sense of a community pride. Everybody had seen the harsh ill effects of the looms shutting down, of gradually receiving more and more meager pay for your work, of absolutely zero infrastructural support. And there was more of a sense of skepticism, and it was more of about us proving to the community that this can work, than there being already an entrenched sense of pride or sense of ownership over this craft. The few weavers we ultimately located, 4 weavers who were still alive, who had woven when the looms were running, and all of them were completely disillusioned with this entire ecosystem, and needed a lot of convincing to come back to it. And eventually, I think that it is only when we can demonstrate to them that reliability, authenticity, and definitely viable, sustainable, continuous income through the face of a challenge like COVID, through declining and burgeoning orders. I mean, that's always a roller coaster of work, and that becomes our responsibility as sort of, I would say, facilitators of this craft, to see if we can actually create the sense of stewardship when none exists. And I think that today we're taking baby steps in that direction. It's still, skepticism is still 70% and optimism is about 30%. But hopefully we can, balance that out. And I think that one of the key factors there is also recognition. It is my dream to have a felicitation, felicitation ceremony for our weavers, our senior most weavers, and really restore that sense of pride in their craft, which is completely lost. So, just now it's sort of a trial phase for them to see, okay, let's see where this is going. But in India, for example, handloom weaving is still considered unskilled labor. So it's really up to us and up to the larger community to appreciate and put the weavers on that pedestal that they deserve, because this is a skill that is getting rarer by the day, and that very few people continue to possess. So this is Hamid Sheikh. He was the first weaver whom we started with, who was driving a minivan, and who till date retains that minivan, because he feels that at any point this whole project might collapse. And he eventually trained more women in the community who are continuing to weave for us, and who for whom it's more who don't have a traditional sense of the craft, but for whom it is more about economic independence and creating that sense of self. So one of our weavers told us, she said that I think that I need to have something of my own apart from my husband and kids, and this gives me that sense of self. So we are trying to build this community out of what was left of the tradition, and what we hope will be a meaningful innovation. And going forward, I'm very optimistic that we will be able to grow the number of looms and continue to keep this craft alive. So thank you. I think that was sort of the sum and summary of my presentation, and I do want to address questions and concerns, and any discussion that we might want to have.
Thank you so much, Arushi. That was absolutely wonderful. We will invite attendees to put any questions you have for Arushi into the chat. We have about a half an hour, so we have a wonderful time frame to really have some discussion and hear more from Arushi. And Arushi, maybe while we wait for some questions to come into the chat, I was wondering if you would you share with us a little bit about your personal history with weaving, and how you came to this really impassioned involvement with the revival of Himroo?
So I don't have, I grew up in Mumbai, which is a very bustling city, and which has no sort of tradition of handloom weaving whatsoever. And I finished college in the early 2000s, which was a time when India was sort of opening up, and there were these malls and coffee shops and multiplexes, which we had never heard of before, coming up all around us. And I actually joined the National Institute of Fashion Technology to study textile and retail management, because I wanted to work with one of these big fashion retail stores that were coming up all over. And it was during the course of our studies that we were sent to a little village in Western India called Surendranagar to study handloom weaving. And it was somewhat of a hardship posting. Nobody wanted to go, and it was a lot of reluctance. But once I went, and you saw these beautiful textiles being woven in fairly abject conditions, it didn't make sense to me that on the one hand we see so much prosperity, and on the other you see a skill set, you see so much beauty, you see so much that is uniquely Indian, and yet there isn't that there's a mismatch somewhere between these two. And so I decided to use my degree to work within the handloom sector. And I joined an NGO called Women Weave, run by a very dynamic board of women to promote women weavers. And, I loved my job. I loved what we were doing in terms of really creating change, and at the same time creating beautiful textiles that were being marketed across the world. And I stayed. I've never thought of leaving. And it's always been about this balancing sort of act of how do you create impact. At the same time, keep in mind that, this is a commercial activity and it needs to be, economically viable for one to be truly benefiting the weavers whom we work with. So it took me, about 10 years of working with various NGOs and export houses before I set up LoomKatha. And the idea being to work with groups whom nobody else is working with. So how can we really make a difference? We don't want to repeat the work that somebody else may have done. That's good work. So reach out to communities that need, sort of support and guidance, and build them to be stronger and more economically viable.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Arushi. Would you like to monitor the chat and answer the questions that you choose, or would you like me to read them to you?
I think it would be better if you could read them, because I'm a little confused.
Sure, no problem.
What's
And
popping
maybe
up where?
I'll be happy to read them. There's a whole list coming in, so we have plenty to discuss. And if you're done with your images, you could stop screen sharing, and then we will see you larger rather than the screen. Okay, let's see here. Okay, we have a mix of technical questions and other questions. So I'm going to start kind of at the top of the list, and let's see. How does Himroo compare to draw loom weaving?
So Himroo was traditionally done on a draw loom, on a 4-shaft draw loom in, say, the 14th and 15th century. But once jacquards began to be introduced within handlooms, and we saw this in all handloom clusters across India, whether it's Banaras or Kanjivaram or Maheshwar or Bengal, the Himroo then began to be woven on a jacquard. But it is, the fundamentals remain the same, in the sense that there is a throw shuttle. So it's not a fly shuttle form of weaving. It's the shuttle is still hand thrown. There is the base fabric, which is a twill or a satin fabric, depending on whether you use a 4-shaft or a 6 or 8-shaft loom. Most Himroo has always been done on a 4-shaft loom. And we use a 120 or between a 120 to a 240 hook jacquard. And the base shuttle forms, interlocks with the warp to form the base. And then you have extra shuttles depending on the number of colors of the design that are used to create the next layer, which is basically the design layer. So the fundamental difference is that in a draw loom, the lifting of the warp is done by the draw boy who sits on top of the loom, and that function is replaced by a jacquard.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question about the jacquard cards. Were you able to use any of the old jacquard cards, or were new ones made?
So we did start with, we found a few old ones, and that was the one that I showed in phase 1, which was basically a completely muddled up design, because the order of the punch cards had been changed, and there was no way to know what was the original order. Some of the jacquards, we found very few, I think 5 or 6 sets of punch cards, and some had been eaten by rats in places. So some had moisture, so they were pretty unusable. We mainly had to work from the textile swatches, and a lot of museums have Himroo textiles, so we look at the designs from there, and then recreate the graphs, and then recreate the punch cards from the graphs.
And are you working entirely with traditional designs that have been recreated, or have you created any new kind of variations on the traditional?
No, so far we haven't created any new variations. We've only changed the colors in some cases.
Okay, and there's a question about the yarns used. If you have anything additional that you would share about the specific yarns. And I remember the other day when you and I met individually, you discussed a little bit about using natural dyes. So that might be
Yes.
a nice question to answer, to discuss that as well.
So again, originally, of course, hand spun cotton was used in the warp and weft. But today in India, hand spun cotton is mostly only usable in the weft. So we have to use mill spun yarn. But we do maintain this similar yarn count, which is a 2x60s in the base warp and weft. And we use silk, 2 or 3 plied silk for the design. Uh, it is a challenge to get yarns in small quantities because I mean, like I said, that entire, so in other areas of India where you have maybe 100, 150 handlooms still running, there will be a local yarn supplier, there will be a local warping agent, there will be a local dyer. So they, you can get small quantities of the yarns that you need. But over here, everything was completely catering only to the mills, which was bulk quantities. And in most cases, what was being passed off as pure cotton was also had some sort of synthetic blend to it. So we actually get the yarns from another weaving cluster, and we hope that we've done simple basic burn testing and things like that to check the authenticity. But yeah, it's always a challenge. But we mainly work with 2x60s cotton and 2 and 3 plied silk for the bulk of the work we do. And of course, when we did the natural dyed project, we worked with again 2x60s naturally dyed cotton, and we needed to ply it 2 or 3 times so that it react. So basically, the structure of the weave should remain strong. If the extra weft is either too thin or too thick, the fabric becomes unstable because it's moving faster than the base weft. So we need to always do a bit of trial and error till we figure out the ideal combination.
Thank you, Arushi. What are the weight of the textiles? And how did you find this particular textile?
So, like I said, when one works with weaves of India or different techniques, Himroo is always something that is mentioned in a lot of documentation, etc. Also because Western India doesn't have too many of its own weaves as compared to, so specifically the province of Maharashtra, where this is from, compared to other states which have multiple different types of weaves. Maharashtra has about 3 or 4, and Himroo is one of them. And being from Bombay, which falls within this province, I wanted to start with a weave from this region. And it seemed to me like the other 2 or 3 other weaves were already fairly thriving in comparison. So this is something that I wanted to work with. And like I said, it was a continuous sort of scavenger hunt or treasure hunt, one clue leading to the next, because it was largely undocumented. Eventually, almost 10 months into the project, we discovered a survey which had been done of the craft in 1962, which documented in detail the different parts of the loom, the number of weavers, the raw materials that were used, and a lot of valuable information. So then we had already arrived at some of these conclusions, but it was easier to sort of validate that we were going the right way.
And I think you shared that that even at the beginning of your sort of treasure hunt, that there were even small swatches that were found, like as stuffing in pillows and things. That
yes, they were in a very poorly maintained condition, and it's quite shocking, really, because I'm sure that if a textile collector were to chance upon these textiles, it would be extremely valuable. But it helped us to at least to understand the basics of the weave. and to put together like the jigsaw puzzle to put together things, because otherwise we were relying on pictures that were available at the, textiles behind glass cases in dusty museums in India. So it helped us to get an actual physical feel of the textile.
Mhm.
And to address the weight question, it is so a 2 meter Himroo shawl weighs around 200 to 220 grams, depending on the nature of the design. So it's a medium to heavyweight textile.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arushi. This is a question about acquiring grant funding. And so the question is, in your grant sourcing search, what was the reaction from foreign and domestic granting sources, and how did you find the most success?
So we basically LoomKatha is set up as a for-profit, because I've always believed that, unless we are economically viable, we can't really be creating impact for weavers. And having worked with a lot of NGOs, I've seen both sides of, what happens when a grant comes to an end and marketability hasn't been created. So we were structured as a for-profit from the beginning, which means that we cannot apply for any sort of donation uh, for the work that we do, but we can look at research-based, service-oriented contracts on which we do have to still pay a high percentage of taxes. So, of course, this closed a lot of doors for us in the initial phases. And where we were successful was with an MNC that really believed in the cause, and that was willing to look at these compulsions and accordingly structure the program so that it worked for us and it worked for them. So but overall, I mean, aside from this, in over now almost 12 years of experience, grant funding and raising resources for handlooms, I will say it is one of the most under funded sectors within development studies, within the development sector. If there are any budgets, they're always meager. It gets clubbed with livelihoods, and with a lot of livelihood projects are not understanding enough of the complexities of handloom. So they don't understand that it's not just about paying a stipend to the weaver. You have to have the ancillary industries. You have to look at raw material procurement. You have to look at the entire supply chain. And a lot of grants are just structured around training, which is insufficient. So I do think, and it's always a hard sell. Firstly, because it's considered a woman-dominated sector. So many mainstream funders, quite frankly, they're like, oh, this hobby industry has come to us. So it's difficult. It is very difficult, and like now, I think agriculture and agri-tech and things like that have sort of become mainstream. This still remains a very underfunded sector.
And I think you may have just answered this with the focus on the grant funding being towards livelihood. The follow-up to this question is the heritage and revival message or the economic sustainability message more resonant with potential donors?
It depends on the kind of donor. I think you have to really research and understand what is the impetus that they have. For us with Himroo, it was about heritage because this MNC was locally located. So they were interested in promoting local heritage and culture, and which was vanishing across not just textiles, but within metal crafts, wooden, and other things as well. So so in their case, that was what happened. And I think that if the scale of your project is small, if you don't have large numbers to show that, this project is going to make thousands of weavers' lives better, it is more time better spent to look at smaller organizations that are building culture and that are looking at the cultural aspect, because they understand a bit more about what you're trying to do. I do feel that that sometimes is better value for your time, because you can't hit everything, and fundraising is so time consuming and so disheartening most of the time, that it's better to look at very, very specific and focused organizations who are also supportive through your journey, because they have seen similar projects and they understand the challenges you're dealing with. And If, however, it's a cluster where you feel that the numbers eventually can scale to be very large, then and you can show that increase in income is definite and tangible. That is so. For Himroo, for example, we do have shown that incomes have risen almost 3 times, and our senior weavers are able to earn a fairly decent, about, I would say, almost 4 times what is the minimum wage of that area. So we do have good impact in terms of income, but then again, it's a small group of about 10 weavers. So no funder whose primary goal is income generation thinks that that is worthwhile enough impact. So yeah, I think that it's really find out who's going to be most interested in the work that you're doing and sort of focus on that.
Great, thank you. Arushi, one of the things I really loved was how you structured the presentation today to touch on each of the 3 themes that our conference is focused on, with the tradition, the innovation, and the community stewardship. And a question that I have is, in the innovation sort of part of that, when you talked about collaborations with designers, I'm curious if you can share with us a bit about what that process is like for you, of having this this traditional weaving that you have revived, and then how that relationship develops with the designer, the sort of collaborative part.
So yeah, so I think again it's very similar to fundraising, in where you have to find like-minded organizations who are not, who don't just want the glamour or the tag of this is a heritage technique, or we are working with a royal textile or something like that, but who truly understand how the process works. So when they come to you with their designs, there is that back and forth, and they are able to understand what you're saying, and not make unreasonable demands, both in terms of design, but also volumes and timelines, because Himroo is a very slow process. We have very limited capacity. So, are, are you willing to work 6 to 8 months in advance to understand, when you get your eventual production order? So it's always back and forth, and there have been a couple of bitter experiences also. So I mean, yeah, it's but also on our part, I think we always need to be very clear and not be over ambitious. It's very hard to refuse work, but sometimes it helps, because it's something that would not have worked out eventually. So these are all learned the hard way, because we have taken on things and then realized that it's going to be difficult. So yeah, so I think, but the process is, I mean, basically we receive the spec sheets from the designers, we create samples, the samples are approved, and then the production of the fabric starts. If there is tailoring required, then we work with another women's group in Bombay to do the tailoring, and then to eventually ship the final products.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arushi. We have a couple of questions about the textiles that we see on your screen. So one person has asked if you can tell us about the piece hanging behind you.
Oh, that's not Himroo. That's just curtain material. So I have not much information on that, except that I liked it. But yeah, but the piece I'm wearing is a Himroo shawl. And yeah, that's one of the first designs that we revived.
And the question about the piece you're wearing, it says, your scarf has metallic yarns. Are they mixed with silk? And is this a popular style or popular look with Himroo?
So this piece particularly actually does not have metallic yarns. It's just white silk. But because of the base, the dullness of the base cotton, it has that sheen, which gives it, that's the beauty of Himroo, the sheen of the silk over the base cotton. So it gives it that appearance of luster. We do have designs where we also work with metallic yarns because that is popular in India, but we blend it with the silk, so the softness is maintained.
That's amazing. It truly does have a shimmer, like on the screen. It looks as though it's silver thread. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Are younger people learning to weave from the older experienced weavers?
Yes. So we are training women to younger women to learn from the three senior weavers who are with us. And that's a continuous process. So we lost two of our promising young weavers because, I mean, one of them is starting a family and one of them is getting married and moving away. So there is this continuous churn, but we do continue to train and sort of keep the numbers stable.
Wonderful. And how do the weavers feel about the project? I know you've mentioned that you're working on the sort of the pride aspect, the pride instilled in the community for the weaving. Do you have anything else you would add about how the weavers feel?
So I think really it's about credibility, building our credibility with them, and ensuring that the flow of work is continuous, the payments are made on time, the payments are commensurate with the amount of work that is put in. So when we start any new design, it's always sampled by a senior weaver, and then we have a discussion about how much time it would take him, and therefore how much should be the payment. And regardless of whether we sell the piece or not, we ensure that their payments are made within a couple of days of the piece being woven. So I think that credibility and trust has to be built, and that really helps us to retain. Because what happened was, once we did manage to sort of achieve some level of success, and we could start restart these looms, there were other parties who were interested in poaching our weavers. But it didn't happen because we had built that trust, and because we could see them through the tough times of COVID. I think they felt secure enough to know that this will sustain itself. So I'm hopeful. I mean, it's still a challenge, but it's just hopeful that we can continue and eventually, also in terms of number of weavers, grow it a bit more. Maybe have a better space eventually, which is more, which can be a sort of a showcase as well as a weaving center. So because Aurangabad is actually a UNESCO city. The famous Buddhist Ajanta caves are in that location. So there is a lot of tourist traffic that does come in. So eventually, hopefully, we can set up a really beautiful center that is of interest to not just to textile lovers, but to a larger sort of tourist audience.
That sounds wonderful. One thing that you spoke about when you were discussing the community stewardship aspect, the idea of having a sort of celebration or a ceremony with the weavers to sort of instill pride and to, you know, make clear the importance of this effort. I thought that was a wonderful idea.
Yes, so that's something that has always been on my mind, but initially due to COVID and now because we are so caught up in sort of keeping production going, that I haven't been able to do it yet. But eventually, I hope to at some point in the following year, really have that ceremony and do it in a way that is truly meaningful. So I feel, because I realize that when we speak to our viewers, that they don't understand the value of what they're doing. And like for example, Mr. Koje, who wove the silk piece for us, he remembers in the 1980s there was a government ceremony in which he received a little plaque, and he's still so proud of it, and he's it's such a something he holds on to so much that I feel like I think it would really improve the morale, and it's needed. I think we don't value their work enough.
Thank you, Arushi. One person is asking if we can see the back of your shawl to see what the back of the weaving looks like.
Well, so this shawl, we actually line the shawls. So with a thin sort of fine cotton lining, so you can't really see the back. But I did notice that there were a couple of questions regarding that are floats created. So when the design is like this, which is a very all over design, so you can see that the blue areas, the base areas are very small. So the floats created at the back are also very small. So this piece would actually be finished even without lining. But what happens is when there are 2 and 3 color designs, then there are a large number of floats, and then it becomes imperative to line the fabric. So there is no mechanism of interlocking the floats at the back. Some Himroo shawls later, which were made in the 80s and 90s, had introduced a supplementary warp. So there were like these lines after every 20 warp threads, a supplementary warp, which locked in the weft, but that just added to the weight of the fabric, and it created a funny ribbed sort of structure on the back, which didn't really enhance anything. And the floats, because it was after every 20 yarns, there were still small floats. So it was a very ad hoc kind of adjustment, and we realized that it's not there in the older pieces, so we decided not to continue to use it.
There is a question about the sales of your weavings. What percentage of your production is sold domestically in India, and what percentage internationally?
So I think it's been about 50-50, because also we have a lot of interest from Indians who live abroad. So I don't know really how to classify that as domestic or local, but I have considered it as local. I mean, so far we consider that as a sort of domestic, even though the product might be shipped abroad. But in terms of, foreign buyers, I would say that, yeah, it's about 50% of what we produce.
Great, thank you. Arushi, we are drawing to the end of our time with you, and this has been so incredibly inspiring and informative. Thank you so much for putting this presentation together and sharing your time with us.
Thank you. And as always, I mean, the questions are just so exciting, and it's so nice to talk about technical things which nobody usually has the time to listen to. So it's been really an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you again, Arushi. This has been an absolutely wonderful hour with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the comments also that I'm reading in the chat, all the appreciation. Thank you so much. It's been really great.